It's a story of a boy, no different from any other child who dreamed of laughter, friendship, and being accepted. But life often writes different stories for different people, and his childhood was written in shadows. Every morning, as he walked to school, he carried more than just a backpack on his shoulders. He carried fear. Fear of the names they would call him. Fear of the laughter that followed him down the hallway. Fear of being noticed. And at the same time, fear of being invisible. The other kids saw him as an easy target. His quiet nature, his small frame, his tendency to stay alone. These were enough reasons for them to pick on him. They mocked the way he dressed, the way he spoke, even the way he looked when he sat silently at his desk. Their words were sharp, like tiny arrows, each one piercing his heart. At first, he thought it was just a phase. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe tomorrow they would finally leave him alone. But tomorrow came, and nothing changed. The names grew harsher, the pranks became crueler, and the laughter became louder. There were days when he wanted to fight back, to scream, to show them that their words couldn't define him. But the fear was stronger. So, he stayed silent, absorbing every insult, every push, every cruel joke. In the classroom, he sat in the back row, trying to shrink into his chair, wishing he could disappear. During lunch breaks, he sat alone, poking at his food, pretending he wasn't bothered by the empty seat across from him. At home, he locked himself in his room, where no one could see the tears he tried so hard to hide. But even within the walls of his room, he wasn't free. The echoes of their laughter followed him. The names they called him repeated in his mind until he almost believed them. Useless, weak, pathetic. Those words became a part of his identity. And slowly, they built a cage around his spirit. He started to avoid looking at the mirror. When he did, he didn't see a child with potential, dreams, or worth. He only saw the reflection of what they told him he was. A shadow, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Sometimes, he asked himself questions that no child should ever ask. Why me? Why am I not good enough? Why can't I be like them? Questions without answers, questions that sank him deeper into silence. And yet, in the middle of all this pain, there was a small spark. A spark of hope that refused to die out. It showed itself in little ways. The way he loved drawing in the corner of his notebooks, the way he felt peace when he watched the sunset, the way he smiled faintly when a kind teacher praised his handwriting. Tiny moments that reminded him, deep down, that maybe there was more to him than the shadows of bullying. But those moments were fleeting. Most of the time, the pain returned, heavier than before. The boy grew skilled at hiding his feelings. To the world, he was just the quiet kid. But inside, he was carrying scars that no one could see. And so, the years went on. The bullying never truly stopped. It became a part of his childhood, shaping him, pressing him down. He grew used to silence, used to loneliness, used to the idea that he was different, and not in a good way. This was his world. A world where every day felt like a battle he didn't sign up for. A world where shadows of cruelty stretched longer than the light of kindness. But what he didn't know then, standing in the middle of those shadows, was that life had not finished writing his story. The boy who lived through pain would one day discover strength. The child who was bullied would one day find his voice. And the shadows of his childhood would become the foundation of a future he couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, he was just a boy, lost in the storm of his early years. A boy searching for light, but trapped in the darkness of other people's cruelty. Childhood ends, but its memories rarely do. The boy who once walked nervously down school hallways had now grown older. His body changed, his voice grew deeper. But inside, those same wounds stayed alive. He thought that leaving childhood behind would mean leaving the bullying behind as well. But the truth was crueler. Though the voices of his classmates had faded, their words remained sharp, echoing endlessly in his mind. Every insult, every laugh, every push into the dirt, they lived inside him like ghosts. He carried those ghosts everywhere. When he walked into a new classroom or a gathering, he felt the same fear he once felt as a child. What if they laugh at me? What if they see through me? What if I'm not enough? These questions whispered to him constantly. In conversations, he hesitated to speak. His voice often trailed off, as if he expected to be mocked. When he looked at other people, he compared himself to them and always believed he fell short. Confidence was a language he had never learned. Even in moments where no one was judging him, he judged himself. He remembered the names, useless, weak, outsider, and believed them to be true. He doubted his own abilities, not because he lacked them, but because years of bullying had convinced him that he did. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying scenes from the past. The laughter, the cruel words, the loneliness. They returned like uninvited visitors, reminding him that he was still trapped. Sleep rarely brought peace. It only carried him into dreams where the same shadows followed. And yet, from the outside, nobody saw his struggle. He became good at wearing masks. To his family, he pretended he was fine. To his classmates, he acted invisible. To the world, he seemed quiet but ordinary. Inside, though, he carried a weight heavier than anyone could imagine. That weight showed itself in small ways. He walked with slumped shoulders, as if the world itself pressed him down. He avoided eye contact, afraid of what others might see in his eyes. He rarely smiled, because joy felt like something that belonged to others, not to him. His dreams, once bright and endless, faded into the background. As a child, he might have wanted to become an artist, an explorer, maybe even a leader. But now, he barely dared to dream. What's the point? He told himself. People like me don't make it that far. The saddest part was not that others doubted him. The saddest part was that he doubted himself. The voices of bullies had left scars so deep that he became his own critic, his own enemy. Still, somewhere in the quiet corners of his heart, there was a flicker of longing. A longing to be free. To live without the chains of his past. To stand tall. To speak without fear. To smile without shame. He longed for a day when the weight would finally fall off his shoulders. But for now, he carried it. He carried it into his teenage years, into his early adulthood, into every new place he entered. The bullying was no longer around him, but it lived inside him. He didn't know it yet, but life was waiting for the moment when he would decide he had carried enough, waiting for him to break the cycle, to face the shadows, and to find the courage he never thought he had. For now, though, he was a boy becoming a man, walking forward but always looking backward, a person shaped by pain, but not yet transformed by it. A life in waiting. Life has a way of pushing us until we reach a wall. For him, that wall came slowly, like a storm building on the horizon. The weight of his past had followed him for years, through school, into young adulthood, and into every corner of his life. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury it under routines, distractions, and silence. But the truth was always there. The shadows of childhood had grown into chains that bound his future. One evening, he found himself sitting alone in his room. The same room where, as a boy, he had hidden from laughter and insults. The walls were quiet now, but his mind was loud. The questions returned. Why am I like this? Why can't I change? Why do I still feel small? He stared at his reflection in the mirror. The boy he once was had grown into a young man. But the pain in his eyes hadn't aged a day. It was the same sadness, the same fear, the same loneliness. For the first time in years, he realized how little had changed. He was older, but he was still trapped. And in that moment, something inside him broke. Not in the way it had broken before. When bullies' words cut into him, this was different. This was a deeper crack, one that revealed a truth he had been avoiding. He could not keep living this way. The pressure of carrying the past, the constant self-doubt, the endless silence, it became too much. His heart pounded, his fists clenched. And for the first time, he felt anger. Not at the bullies, not even at the world, but at himself for letting their words live inside him for so long. He whispered to the mirror, almost trembling, enough. That one word was the beginning. Enough of hiding. Enough of carrying their voices. Enough of shrinking into the background of life. He had reached the edge of what he could endure. And instead of falling apart, he decided to rise. But it wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no instant transformation. It was quiet. A quiet breaking point that whispered in his soul, if you want a different life, you must create it. That night, he stayed awake, thinking of all the years lost to fear. He remembered the boy sitting alone in the classroom, the teenager afraid to speak, the young man doubting every step. And for the first time, He felt compassion for that boy, for himself. He realized something powerful. The bullies had left. But he was still letting them win by believing their lies. The battle was no longer outside, it was inside. And he was the only one who could choose to fight it. It was a frightening thought, but also a liberating one. For the first time, he felt a spark of control. If the cage was built in his mind, then maybe the key was there too. The breaking point didn't fix everything, but it cracked the silence. He began to imagine a life where he wasn't defined by the past. A life where he stood tall, spoke clearly, and believed in himself. A life where confidence wasn't just a dream, but a choice. Tears filled his eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the weight of realization. Change was possible. Hard, yes. Painful, yes. But possible. The boy who had once been bullied was now standing on the edge of something new. The breaking point was not his end, it was his beginning. The morning after his breaking point felt different. The world outside looked the same streets, the same sky, the same people walking past without noticing him. But something inside him had shifted. It was small, fragile, almost like a flicker of light in a dark cave. Yet it was enough. For years, he had told himself, "This is who I am. I can't change." But now, a new thought whispered back, "What if I can?" That single question became the spark. At first, it wasn't about grand plans or impossible dreams. It was about tiny choices. That morning, instead of walking with his head down, he tried to lift it. His shoulders still slumped from habit. But for the first time, he was aware of them. He adjusted, straightened. It felt strange, but it also felt powerful. Later, when someone spoke to him, instead of mumbling, he forced himself to make eye contact. It lasted only a second before he looked away. But that second mattered. It was proof that he could push back against the chains. The spark grew whenever he made these small decisions. He began reading books about people who had struggled and overcome. Their stories reminded him that pain was not the end, it could be a beginning. He started writing his own thoughts in a notebook, pouring out the words he had held inside for years. On the pages, he wasn't weak or pathetic. He was honest, searching, human. One day, while sitting in the park, he noticed children laughing and playing. For the first time, their laughter didn't remind him of bullies. It reminded him of something else, the sound of life, free and unafraid. He wondered, what would it feel like to live that way again? That question fueled the fire inside him. The spark also showed itself in the way he spoke to himself. Where once he repeated the bully's words, now he tried something new. Instead of saying, "I can't," he whispered, "I will try." Instead of saying, "I'm nothing," he wrote, "I am learning." These words felt clumsy, even fake at first. But slowly they began to sink in. Of course, the journey wasn't smooth. Some days, the old voices returned, louder than ever. He still felt fear when walking into a room. He still struggled to trust himself. But the difference now was that he no longer accepted those feelings as permanent. He saw them as battles to be faced, not prisons to live in. He took one brave step. He joined a small class on public speaking. On the first day, his hands shook, his voice cracked, and his heart raced as he introduced himself. But when it was over, he realized something life-changing. He had survived. The world hadn't ended. No one had laughed. And that small victory became fuel for the next step. Little by little, the spark of change grew brighter. He started exercising, not to impress anyone, but to feel stronger in his own skin. He learned to breathe deeply when fear tried to suffocate him. He reached out to one person, a mentor, who encouraged him, reminding him that confidence is not given, it is built. The boy who once lived in shadows was now learning to walk in light. His transformation was not complete, but the process had begun. For the first time, he felt hope not as a distant dream, but as a living force inside him. And though he still had a long journey ahead, one thing was certain: he had chosen a new path. A path toward confidence, freedom, and self-belief. The spark of change was no longer just a flicker, it was a flame. Change is never instant. It is not a switch that flips overnight, but a climb, slow, demanding, and filled with obstacles. For him, the journey after the spark was exactly that, a climb toward becoming someone new. At first, the climb was steep. His old self, The one who doubted every move still lived within him. Whenever he tried to push forward, the echoes of the past pulled him back. What if they laugh? What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? But this time, he didn't stop. He kept climbing. He began setting small goals. Each one felt like a mountain on its own. Wake up earlier. Exercise 3 times a week. Speak up once in every class. Greet a stranger instead of avoiding eye contact. They were simple tasks, but for him, they were victories. Every time he achieved one, he felt a little stronger, a little lighter, as if the weight of the past loosened its grip. But there were setbacks too, days when fear won, when old voices shouted louder than his courage. On those days, he stumbled. He sometimes skipped goals, avoided challenges, and felt the old shame creep back. Yet, what made this chapter of his life different was that he no longer stayed down. He stumbled, yes, but he stood back up. He was learning that failure wasn't the end. It was part of the climb. He found new strength and discipline. He discovered that confidence wasn't about being fearless. It was about showing up even when fear was present. Slowly, his body grew stronger from exercise. His posture changed, his voice steadied. And people noticed. Friends, teachers, even strangers saw something different in him. They couldn't see the battles he fought inside, but they could see the results, a young man who was no longer hiding. He also began testing himself with challenges he once thought impossible. Speaking in front of a group, asking questions without worrying if they were stupid, sharing his ideas openly. Each time, his heart pounded, his palms sweated. But afterward he realized, the fear didn't destroy him. It shrank. The climb wasn't just about actions, it was about mindset. For years, he had believed the bully's words. Now, he was rewriting the story in his head. He repeated to himself daily, I am capable. I am worthy. I am growing. These affirmations felt awkward at first, almost unbelievable. But over time, they became the new voice in his mind, louder than the old ones. There were moments of pride too, small but powerful. The first time he stood in front of a crowd and didn't shake. The first time he looked someone in the eyes and felt no need to look away. The first time he laughed with others and realized he wasn't pretending. He was genuinely happy. He still carried his scars, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they fueled him. They reminded him of how far he had come and how much further he could go. He wasn't just climbing away from the pain. He was climbing toward a version of himself he had always wanted to meet. And with every step upward, he discovered something beautiful. Confidence wasn't about being perfect, it was about persistence. It was about choosing, every day, to keep climbing, even when the mountain seemed endless. The boy who once walked with slumped shoulders now walked with his head high. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. The climb was only beginning, but already, he was higher than he had ever imagined. The climb had tested him. Step by step, he fought fear, self-doubt, and the shadows of his past. But something had changed now. He was no longer climbing just to escape the pain. He was climbing to reach his potential. And with every victory, he became stronger, steadier, more unshakable. Confidence no longer felt like a dream. It had become part of him, built through effort, discipline, and courage. He no longer whispered words of doubt. Instead, his inner voice spoke with certainty. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see the weak, lonely boy he once believed he was. He saw someone resilient, someone powerful, someone who had endured storms and was still standing tall. His body carried the proof of change. His shoulders were no longer slumped. They were squared with pride. His eyes didn't dart away anymore. They held steady, calm. And sure, his voice was no longer shaky. It carried weight, conviction, and clarity. But the true transformation wasn't just in how he looked. It was in how he lived. He began stepping into leadership roles, taking responsibilities that once would have terrified him. In class, he volunteered first. At work, he gave suggestions confidently. Among friends, he wasn't the quiet one anymore. He was the one others turned to for encouragement. The same people who once overlooked him now admired him. Some even asked, "How did you change so much?" He smiled, because the answer wasn't easy to explain. His transformation hadn't been sudden or magical. It was built day by day, through struggles and small wins. The insults from his past no longer haunted him. They were still memories, but now they carried no power. When he remembered the laughter of bullies, he didn't feel pain anymore. He felt gratitude, because their cruelty had built his strength. Their rejection had taught him self-respect. Their doubt had fueled his determination. He had become unshakable not because life became easy, but because he had learned to stand firm when life was hard. Fear still appeared sometimes, but now it was different. Instead of running from it, he faced it head-on. Doubt still tried to whisper, but his new voice spoke louder. One powerful moment came when he stood in front of a large audience to share his story. His hands didn't shake this time. His voice was steady, his heart calm. He spoke about his journey, the bullying, the loneliness, the breaking point, and the climb. When he finished, the silence in the room broke into applause. Not because his story was perfect, but because it was real. He had become the very person he once needed when he was younger, someone who showed that change was possible. That night, he walked home under the stars, smiling. For years, he had looked at himself as not enough. But now, he knew he was more than enough. He had turned his scars into strength, his pain into purpose. He was no longer the boy who lived in shadows. He was the man who created light. Becoming unshakable didn't mean he would never face challenges again. Life would always bring difficulties. But the difference now was clear. He had built a foundation so strong that no storm could destroy it. He had become confident, not arrogant. Strong, but still kind. Resilient, yet compassionate. He had risen from the weight of his past and built a new life, one that inspired others to believe in themselves too. The boy who once doubted every step had grown into a man who walked with certainty. Unshakable. The transformation was complete. The boy who once walked through hallways with his head down, crushed by words and laughter, was gone. In his place stood a man who had built himself from the ground up, strong, confident, and unshakable. But his journey did not end with himself. True growth, he realized, was never just about personal victory. It was about what you did with that victory afterward. He remembered too clearly what it felt like to sit alone at lunch, to dread waking up each morning, to cry silently into a pillow so no one would hear. He remembered the feeling of being small, invisible, and powerless. And because he remembered, he made a promise. No child, no person, should ever feel as alone as he once did. That promise became his mission. He began sharing his story, first with small groups, then with larger audiences. His words carried weight because they were born from pain. People listened, not just because he spoke confidently, but because he spoke truthfully. He didn't hide the scars. He revealed them, showing that scars were not signs of weakness, but proof of survival. In schools, he met children who were going through the same battles he once fought. He sat with them, listened to them, and told them what he wished someone had told him. You are enough. You are stronger than you think. This pain does not define you, it prepares you. Some kids cried when they heard him. Others smiled for the first time in weeks. Parents thanked him, teachers invited him. And slowly, his story became a light for those still trapped in darkness. But it wasn't just about public speaking. In his everyday life, he carried the legacy of his transformation. He was kinder, more patient, more understanding. When he saw someone sitting alone, he reached out. When he noticed someone struggling, he offered encouragement. He had turned his greatest wound into his greatest gift, empathy. The world around him began to change too. Friends respected him not just for his confidence, but for his heart. Strangers found hope in his words. Even some of the people who had once bullied him crossed paths with him again. To his surprise, he didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, he felt peace. They had been part of his story, but they no longer had power over it. He had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for his own. And forgiveness, he discovered, was another kind of freedom. Years later, when people looked at him, they didn't see the scars of his past. They saw the light of someone who had overcome. He had become more than confident. He had become an inspiration. A living reminder that pain could be turned into purpose, that weakness could be transformed into strength, and that no story had to end in shadows. One evening, as he walked home after speaking at a school, he passed by a boy sitting alone on a park bench. The boy's eyes were downcast, his shoulders heavy, his face familiar in its sadness. He saw himself in that boy, the younger version of who he used to be. He sat down next to him, offering not just words, but presence. In that quiet moment, he realized the full circle of his journey. Once, he had been the boy who needed saving. Now, he was the man who could offer it. The legacy of light wasn't about changing the whole world at once. It was about changing one life at a time. And with every person he reached, every word he shared, and every act of kindness he gave, his light grew brighter. The boy who was bullied had become the man who inspired. His story was no longer one of pain, it was one of power. And this was his legacy, to prove that no matter how dark the shadows of childhood, there was always a way to step into the light.